Regions and communities are also highly uneven beneficiaries of military spending, as you probably all know. Our book, which will be out in May, called The Rise of the Gun Belt, argues that there's a half-moon-shaped crescent of the country extending from Seattle down through California, the Intermountain States, Texas, Florida, up through Long Island, Washington, D.C., by the way, is a very big part of it, up through Long Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and that this portion of the economy, and in a way that's unprecedented in world development, no other advanced industrial country has seen so much of its manufacturing center of gravity shift from the older industrial regions to new ones over the course of the post-war period. The center of this gun belt is in Los Angeles, and California's share of prime contracts is 210% of the national average. Massachusetts, on a per capita basis, is 230% of the national average, and that has a lot to do with the Massachusetts miracle, which is more or less coterminant with the Reagan buildup in the 1980s. Connecticut, 330% of the national average, and the East North Central states, only 43% of the national average, and a state like Illinois, only 20% of the national average. Very uneven distribution of prime contracts. In addition, the Northeast, Pacific, and South Atlantic states dominate the research prime contracts, which are key to competitiveness of those industries and regions. California alone got 41% of all prime contracts for research and development to private business firms, and Massachusetts got 28% of all research and development contracts to educational institutions throughout the 1980s. And those patterns, by the way, have been carried through for several decades. It's not surprising that the major highly acclaimed high-tech centers in the United States, which are Silicon Valley, Route 128 around Boston, and the Los Angeles, Orange County area, are precisely the same counties that rank in the top 5 recipients of prime contracts in the United States. There also have been some very good studies recently that show high correlations between relative growth rates of manufacturing, of employment overall, and of population with high levels of defense spending. And I think you can look at the redistricting phenomenon and see what's happened in the 1980s and read there a very powerful effect of military spending on regional growth patterns in the 1980s. If we looked at the congressional district and community level, you would see even higher rates of defense dependency and uneven distribution of contracts and so on. Now, what can we do about all of this? What I've really tried to sketch out for you is an extraordinary dependency of certain industries, regions, firms, and occupations on the defense budget. No matter what happens in the Middle East, there will be defense cuts. You all know that. How big they will be a matter of, in part, the outcome of the war and the political battles that go on. But the problems we have with our economy, the high levels of budget deficits, and so on, will result in longer-term defense cuts. As of December, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that these would be on the order of 20% by 1995. The Department of Defense budget for 1992-93, according to the Defense Budget Project, which did a count of the major weapon systems cuts proposed in the DoD budget, showed cuts of $14.2 billion in just major weapon systems in fiscal 1992 and cuts of $61 billion from 93 through 97. The Pentagon's Office of Economic Adjustment has taken these cuts and tried to estimate what the employment results would be. They estimate that if the cuts were 10% over the next 5 years, 650,000 people would be displaced. If they were 20%, as CBO suggests, that would be 1.3 million, and we can easily apply what we call a multiplier to that of at least 2, I would argue even 3, and see that the effect will be extraordinary. At least 2 million people will be displaced if these kinds of budget cuts take place. And again, as I suggested, these are highly concentrated in certain industries, in certain firms, and certain locations, and that poses a very big problem for us. Okay, what can be done about this? Suppose we had the national political will to cut the defense budget. How could we make this transition that Professor Leontiev has laid out for us? Now, you know, if you're in the post-World War II or post-Korean era, you don't have to worry about this problem much because there's enormous pent-up demand in other sectors of the economy. We don't happen to be in that position right now. The situation in the United States and the economy is much different, and the competitiveness of the economy is a very big problem. It's very hard to see, in the absence of other government commitments to, say, education, infrastructure, housing, and so on, where the stimulus to the economy would come from. That's one thing that is worrying people around the country, and even the Congressional Budget Office, when pressed in December, said, or at least the spokesman for the office said, that he believed that if the recession did get bad, that the most likely thing to happen would be an increase in military spending just simply because it was convenient and easy and a quick way of pumping money into the economy. I think what we're arguing here today is that that is not a long-term solution to the economy and will only continue to do the kind of damage that's been happening in the longer run. If I had more time, I would try to really make the links for you between the poor performance of autos and steel and machinery and even electronics and so on, and the way we've concentrated our resources in these military-related sectors. Now, what is the defense industry doing about it? Since 1989, we've actually had cuts in real outlays. So what has been going on out there? Well, first of all, I think it's pretty clear that defense managers are not taking up this challenge very well. At worst, companies like General Dynamics, which is, by the way, the most defense dependent of all the large contractors, have an explicit strategy of hunkering down and waiting for military spending to rise again. They're just closing or mothballing facilities and waiting, and they have given explicit directions to managers of all their facilities not to consider any alternative uses or engage in any kind of planning of that type. Many smaller firms would like to diversify or convert, but they don't know how to do it. They're scared, they're panicked. They've been operating in a very, very different market environment than the one they would have to, and they say all sorts of embarrassing and funny things at conferences like, well, gee, we went out there and looked at the competition, and there are a lot of competitors out there, and there are even foreign firms out there, and they don't have the marketing expertise and the other things to really be able to do that. There are a few success stories. They're few and far between, and the poor people like Greg Frisbee, who happened to be CEO of a successful firm of this sort, is so beleaguered by requests to show up and talk about his experience and serves on panels that now he pretty much is, you can't find him anywhere. There also have been very interesting community labor and economic development initiatives at the state and local level. In the 1980s, when resources were dried up essentially for economic development around the country, many communities were having a difficult time, not with defense plant closings, with other types of plant closings, and engaged in a large number of experiments to try to see what they could do to generate economic activity in their economies. Keep in mind that places like Illinois had fewer people working in 1986 than they did in 1979. It was a small-scale disaster and certainly what you would call a deep recession in that period of time. There have been some very interesting experiments at alternative use planning, including marketing, technical assistance, finance assistance, institutions set up like the Steel Valley Authority in Pittsburgh, which manage management turnover and act as a place of first resort for people whose plants are closing and so on. And there have been some very exciting new economic and high technology initiatives, particularly the ones that are on the board now, both in Pittsburgh and in LA and Irvine, for new high-speed mass transit systems, which would involve both production and public sector infrastructure components. We've had 10 years of plant closings in this country, or of public concern about plant closings, during which there have been some wonderful innovations at the state and local level in terms of the creation of regional jobs authorities, state capital funds, new product development funds, and cooperative attempts at labor and management alternative use planning. And I would like to be able to say more about those, but I can't. What do we need from the federal level? What we need from the federal level is a policy that actively encourages both private and public initiatives. We need incentives for alternative use planning. I personally think there are a lot of companies out there who would really like to do it. They're scared, they don't know quite how. They can see that they're going to have to do it, but they need some encouragement to do that, and I think there are ways that could be done. We need some kind of industrial development fund that will really help communities and plant managers to restructure their firms, to arrange for management turnover if they need to, and make the investments they need to gear up for other kinds of production. We need a progressive science and technology policy in this country that is not hooked up to DARPA and doesn't consider military missions to be the prime mover for what kinds of science and technology we invest in. And I would say that there are many crying needs, from environmental protection, energy conservation, educational upgrading, infrastructure improvements, affordable housing, that have a science and technology component to them, as well as a public expenditure component, and that's the sort of science and technology policy we should really pursue in this country. Now, my own view, and finally let me say, we need some kind of improvement in the kind of worker assistance and community assistance that we now have. And I say that because I think there will be widespread displacement no matter how well we do on these other issues of conversion or science and technology policy, and we need to be able to help workers who need to upskill in a major way, including going back to school, to bridge that transition. If the Congress does not lay out this kind of alternative, the U.S. economy is bound to slip more and more deeply into its competitive malaise and its singular orientation towards military high-tech preeminence. And I don't think I have to draw the parallels for you between what we're essentially doing in the Middle East, which in my cruder moments I said, well, what we're doing is selling mercenary services to the rest of the world, and an alternative future which would stress human needs, housing, education, transportation, and those kinds of unmet needs in the economy. And finally, let me say, and I don't even think I have to say this in this room, but I think it should be very clear that if we don't have an active conversion program with some funds committed and with some really clear ideas of the institutions that would carry that forward, there are going to be many communities and companies who will feel that they have no choice but to put extraordinary pressure on members of Congress to continue military spending as a way simply of survival for them and their communities. Thank you.